Welcome to You Can Talk to Me, a Beatles podcast. It's time to make our way across the universe and talk all things John, Paul, George and Ringo.
Mark, welcome along to the podcast. Great to have you.
Hello, Mike. Thanks for having me on.
Looking forward to it, mate. And your new work is The Magical Mystery Beatles Quiz Book. Could you please give us a bit of a snapshot of your work as an author, and when did that spark hit you to become a writer?
Well, I trained as a teacher, as a primary school teacher back in the 80s. And my first idea of writing a book was a children's book, but I didn't really get very far. And then one of the key things that happened was seeing Paul McCartney in 1991. He came to Southend-on-Sea, which is where I live, which is about 30 miles east of London, but where the Thames meets the North Sea. And it was, a bit of a surprise, but I managed to get tickets, and it sort of reawakened not just an interest in the Beatles, but I actually wrote a review of it, and I joined the London Beatles fan club. Yeah. And I started writing from there, and gradually it sort of got more and more. I wrote a little article for Record Collector magazine on Wishbone Ash, one of my favorite groups, and then I was writing sleeve notes for CD releases, because obviously CDs were starting to happen in the 90s. And then I wrote this book with the guy who ran the Wishbone Ash Fun Club on the history of Wishbone Ash, which sort of came out at the end of the 90s. And then that was followed by a book on U2, an encyclopedia. And then gradually I sort of branched out. I did a lot of educational stuff, which is partly why the title of the Beatles book is about with multiple choice answers, because some of the things I wrote had multiple choice answers. Yeah. And then in more recent years, I've written about transport, railways, roads, motorways. And then last year I bought a book out on sayings, English sayings, that no one had seemed to have done it before. What do they mean? And things like that. So, the Beatles book is sort of just a continuation of my writing process, if you like.
Yeah, I love the fact, listening to that you haven't stuck in a box in terms of your authorship. You can move to whatever is capturing you.
That's right. I've got quite a wide range of interests, if you like.
I'd love to get a sense of, whenever I'm talking to anyone from Liverpool, I always think it's fascinating to go back and get an understanding of what life was like growing up in that city for people like yourself. What are your memories of your early childhood?
Well, I was actually born in the district of Mossley Hill,
right,
which is Liverpool 18, which is about half a mile from Penny Lane. I was born in a terraced house rather than in a hospital, which I don't know if that was quite unusual then. And where we lived, it's only about half a mile from Forthlin Road, where Paul McCartney was living, and again, about, as the crow flies, about another half mile to Menlough Avenue. And they were all in the same area. So there was a sort of connection there. And Mal Evans, the Beatles roadie come bodyguard, he only lived a few streets away. I didn't know at the time, but reading books and things, that's why I learned about that. But one of the most interesting stories that my mum told me, I don't know if it's true or not, but she told me sort of later in life, not in the height of Beatlemania, but she said that Paul McCartney once pushed me around the block in my pram when I was a baby, because he was going out with one of our babysitters. So
wow,
you never know. Yeah. Yes. So there's definitely a connection there, but it was close by to where we live, where he lived, so it wasn't beyond the bounds of a possibility, certainly. And one of the other things I can remember was the police horses walking past up down our road, because if you're a real hardened Beatles fan, you know that Paul McCartney's house actually looked onto the Liverpool Police mounted division training area. So they would go on their horses all around the area. So yeah,
Yeah.
it was quite an exciting time. It was late 50s, not long after the historic meeting between John Lennon and Paul McCartney at the church fete in the summer of 1957. So lot going on, and I've got because I was quite young. Obviously, I haven't got that many memories, but I had an older brother and sister who were 5 years older than me, and they obviously influenced me a lot. And eventually, in the early 60s, we moved across to the other side of the River Mersey to a town called Ellesmere Port. And the Beatles played there in 1963, by the way, but I was obviously too young to go. But we always used to come back at Christmas to visit friends and neighbours and so on. So, we still had the connection. And then in the 1970s, I actually ended up going to school in Birkenhead, just the other side from Liverpool. So every day, as I was going on the train to school, I could see across the River Mersey to that famous skyline of the pier head, etc., which is great. But you don't at the time sort of take it in. But looking back, it was quite a sight, really. Yeah.
There was a memory that I had from a fellow by the name of Jose McLaughlin. He was for a little while in the Pacemakers with Jerry Marsden
Oh
as the
yeah,
60s were coming to an end. And he was born and bred Liverpool. And I remember him describing as a young boy that it just felt like music was everywhere at this certain point in time, just prior to the Beatles breaking. And he said it felt like every second guy you knew was in a band or forming a band. Do you have a sense of what it was like in Liverpool when the Beatles did start to break, and what it was like to be a part of that first wave of fandom? Are there clear memories for you there of them kind of entering your mind?
yeah, yeah. As I said, I've got an older brother and sister about 5 years older than me, so they sort of obviously got into it first. But one of my earliest memories would be sort of early 1963, seeing them on a program called Thank Your Lucky Stars, which was quite rare because there wasn't much popular music either on the radio or on television. It was before Ready Steady Go and Top of the Pops and so on. So it was quite a good program. And at that time, the main star musical act or star in Britain was Cliff Richard and the Shadows, who'd sort of been popular for the last few years, and they still were having hits in 1963. But once the Beatles took over, they sort of faded, obviously. But they were on the show, and then it was a showcase for all the Merseybeat acts. So that was probably the first introduction I had, and then as the year went on, our first Beatles record in the house was the Twist and Shout EP, which we used to play to death. We had a little tiny record player, not a big one, a little portable thing that we used to share. And then for my 6th birthday, one of my presents wasn't just toys, but was She Loves You. So that's when it all broke in our house. And then a few months later, it was my sister's birthday, and she got I Want to Hold Your Hand single for one of her birthday presents. So from then on, every time a Beatles single came out, we'd buy it more or less, right through to the end of the 60s, really. So that was one thing. And then with my sister, probably being a big Paul fan and her friends, we managed to get a few things. So I've bought a few things to show you. This was one of the magazines we had, early 64.
Yeah.
And then most people will be familiar with these, the Beatles book and so on. And then a couple of other things we had. This is a souvenir thing from the program Thank You Lucky Stars.
Yeah.
And of course, introduced by Brian Matthew. But the first people you see are the Beatles in it, of course.
Yeah.
Because gradually people realised anything to do with the Beatles sells. So that's part of the reason I think why they became so popular. It wasn't just the teenagers, but they appealed to all ages, really, from children like myself right through to older parents, and then grannies and so on that like some of the songs. So they had a wide wide appeal, really.
I'm always fascinated by that idea of what it was like when it was happening, because now obviously it's history and it's
Yeah,
you can kind of go back and unpack the whole story in pieces and discover it that way. But when it was unfolding, I remember a good friend of mine was telling me this story about his grandmother and her discovery of the band in '63 and hearing "I Want to Hold Your Hand" for the first time. So it might have been "I Want to Hold Your Hand" or "She Loves You," and her comment was, "I'd never heard anything that fast. It just sounded
yeah,
so quick." And of course,
yeah.
you go back now with modern ears, and it's like, yeah, come on, what? But for her, it was thrilling because nothing sounded that energetic and quick out of the gates. So I can only imagine what it was like for young people as it's happening. My dad used to tell the story, and I've shared it before on the pod, of going in to visit my mum in 1966 to take her for a lunch date, and she was working in a retail store in Melbourne, and the radio was playing, just a transistor in this little store, and the radio announcer introduced the new Beatles single for the first time on Australian airwaves in Melbourne. And he said suddenly the noise in the store went quiet. People sort of stopped speaking and everyone kind of turned, and Day Tripper started. And he still remembers that opening on the guitar, and he was a player as well. And he said, I remember everyone just stopped and we all stood and listened and waited to hear what it was. And you can't imagine culturally a time like that. It's quite remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the early 60s, you could argue, was very black and white. And then gradually, as the Beatles progressed, it became colourful. And, when they first started, people were saying, oh, they had long hair. And now they should say that that's not long hair. And if you told someone in 1963, you wait in 5 or 6 years, that'll be long hair. And, that was just sort of one of the fashion influences they had on people. And they, obviously they appealed to teenagers, but it wasn't just teenage girls, it was teenage boys as well, because they sort of identified with them in many ways. That they weren't sort of a bit boisterous and pushy like the Rolling Stones. They were amenable and sort of friendly and approachable, if you like. So
Mm.
and the other thing was, throughout 1963 they were gradually getting more popular, and then as soon as they appeared at the Royal Variety Show, that's when it really took off, because all the national newspapers cottoned on to them, and then they were news in all the papers and on the television and everything. And from then on, you couldn't sort of escape the Beatles. They were everywhere, really.
Mm. And of
Yeah.
course, they're born in Liverpool, they're forged in Hamburg. Those two cities have a big impact on them and are transformative for them. What do you think it is for yourself about Liverpool? I mean, obviously at that time, as they're growing up, American music is coming in, and we're getting all the sailors that are coming in through the ports and sharing music. But there seems to be, as I said some time ago in my conversation with Jose from the Pacemakers, with Liverpool, it seems like there was something in the water at that time. And it certainly seems to have informed their character, their resilience. I think there's a quote from Paul McCartney that says, and I'm paraphrasing, that coming from Liverpool is where he discovered grit. There's something about grit in Liverpudlians. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, a lot of Liverpudlians have had a hard time in life, with poverty, and it's sort of a hodgepodge of different races or people from different countries. It's a mixture of Irish, Scottish, Welsh, as well as English. So it was like a crossroads, and they all mixed. And then, not forgetting, it had the first sort of significant Chinese population
Hmm.
from the early 1900s, and then a lot of black people. So people, had to get along, and there's always something special. I mean, I'm probably biased, but about people from Liverpool, that everyone who goes there says how friendly they are and so on. So, you know, that obviously had an influence, as you say, all the fact it's a port and people were coming in from America, especially with the records. But Recently, a few weeks ago, I was able to interview Rod Davis,
Mm,
one of the original Quarrymen, because I also do a podcast called Mark Chatterton's Rock Files,
yeah.
and he was on it recently, and he was saying, it, in the 50s, it was all jazz mainly, and then it was skiffle that sort of caused it to change. It wasn't really rock and roll that came in after skittle, and then gradually, obviously people after the war, younger people had a bit more money and so on. So I think that a bit more affluence sort of helped people could afford to buy the instruments and form groups, and it was a way of letting off steam, coupled with the fact that there wasn't conscription, because the early Beatles were very worried about being conscripted, and then I think it stopped sort of about 1960 or whatever. So that was a spur. You got a bit more freedom and so on, and obviously there was still a very strict moral code in most aspects, but people were starting to get a little bit more freedom, and that came in with the music.
Mm. There is so much about that story that you couldn't have written it better, could you? The likelihood that these guys would all live, as you described at the start of our conversation, in such close proximity, and
Yeah.
they and then the lining up of Brian, the lining up of George Martin. I mean, the list goes on and on. It
Mm.
was right time, right place, beyond belief. It's so many levels.
Yeah. It was almost like fate, if you like.
Yeah,
It was all meant to happen. Yeah,
yeah, all preordained. I think even Paul's made that comment in interviews over the years, and for him
yeah,
also, it felt almost like, well, this is how this is going to play out. If we were to talk about the book, The Magical Mystery Beatles Quiz Book, there's a reference on the cover about 1,000 questions with multiple choice answers, and I love that story you told at the beginning of our chat about the idea of that coming from perhaps your schooling or your teaching background, which I think is terrific.
yeah,
This idea of the multiple choice.
yeah. I mean, I thought you could just have the questions without the answer, and I thought that could backfire. It could be a bit too hard for people. So I've tried to do a mixture of questions. So there are some easy ones, some medium ones, and some hard ones for the hardcore fans. And the way I've done it's sort of, if you can either read it through page one right through to page 200 or whatever, or you can go dip into it in different parts. It's up to you. But I've done it not so that there's 10 mixed questions. It's so I start with all the music first, because that's the most important thing. So I do the singles and then all the different albums. I do one section on American releases, because obviously there was quite a significant difference there. A section on the EPs, section on songs that the Beatles gave away, and so on. And then after the music, there's all the people. So there's sections for each of the four Beatles, plus Pete Best, plus Stuart Sutcliffe, plus Brian Epstein, plus George Martin, and so on. And then people associated and people who worked at NEMS, people who worked at Apple, and so on. So it goes into sort of every aspect of their life. And then there's the places: Liverpool, Hamburg, New York, India, whatever. And then there's the radio and TV appearances, because I think that's quite important, along with the films, and then all the different concerts and tours. So everyone around the world is sort of represented wherever they went. And then there's a sort of odds and ends section, things like the fashions, the legal matters, because there's obviously a lot of legal things going on with the Beatles in different areas, drugs they took, things like that. And then finally, right at the end, if you're a quiz master or you just want a mixture of questions, there's 10 sections of general questions. So it covers sort of every aspect of the Beatles, but only up until May 1970. I haven't really gone on to any solo stuff. I think it's important just to stick with the Beatles. So
Yeah,
there you have it in a
it's
nutshell.
well, it's fascinating that it's good for me to understand that process, because you've obviously gone 360 degrees and covered so much of that
Yeah.
story, which I think is a terrific thing to do. When you went through the process of research, and I'm sure a lot of it was intuitive, but when you found yourself digging in, did you unearth any facts or interesting tidbits that you thought, there you go, that's fascinating? Were there any kind of realizations that you yourself made?
Yeah, I learned quite a lot from it, certainly. I mean, I didn't know about George Harrison going to America in 1963 to visit his sister. That's something that came about through the research. And another thing I learned was when they were filming Help in Austria, John and Paul ended up playing live with the house band, a German band, and jamming with them one night after filming. Little things like that, and then the fact that George Harrison was probably the first Beatle to have a criminal record because he crashed the van in February 1963 when they were coming back from a gig in Hull, and
Oh, there
he
you go.
ended up driving the van off the road, and I didn't know about that. And then
No.
he got banned for driving for a bit, and Paul McCartney also got a speeding fine, and he got banned as well. So little things like that. But I think the fans like to find little bits of trivia. So I've tried to include as many of those sort of things in the book as well.
Yeah, there's the fact that you're even mentioning those little bits of information. I found myself leaning in because I didn't know the story about George. It kind of ties into this idea of endless fascination with this story. Paul's just charted #1 in the UK there for a while with the new album. There's the biopics coming. Obviously, we've just recently had the anthology back on screens, realised for a new generation. It's 2026 and none of it's slowing down, and we're still endlessly fascinated. I'm 57 and I'm leaning in as you're telling me a story about George Harrison losing his license or being fined and getting a criminal record driving a van from a gig in Hull. And there's a little part of me that gets excited by something new.
Yeah.
What is that, do you think? Because here we are still talking about it, still fascinated about it, and still peeling back layers of it and finding that it's still engaging. What do you think that is about those guys and that story?
I think it's firstly that they were unique. No one has ever sort of emulated them in the wide area of success they've had. The fact that you've got the Lennon McCartney writing partnership, that was pretty unique at the time because most acts had someone who wrote the hits for them and they just sang the songs. And then also the fact that they were a group of 4 equal individuals rather than just the lead singer and the backing group, and that was quite new. And then there's lots of other firsts that they did, like bringing out LPs or long playing records, albums that that wasn't normal really. It was like film soundtracks that people had. In our household, the only albums or LPs we had were West Side Story and South Pacific until the Beatles started releasing albums, then other people did, and so on. And then there's all the fashions and the fact that the press wanted couldn't get enough of them. So they were all over the 60s. The 60s were the Beatles, but obviously they weren't all the Beatles because there were so many other groups. But they influenced so many people, and that has sort of been a lasting legacy. Obviously, once they split in the early 70s, that sort of faded for a bit, and then with the death of John Lennon, it all started picking up again. And ever since, there's always new generations that come along and they get influenced. My eldest son, Alex, he helped me with the book, and I remember taking him to one of the Beatles conventions in the 1990s in Liverpool, and he got into them big time, and he's a massive fan. And as I say in the introduction to the book, he probably knows more about Beatles than I do. So it's there's always a new generation, and I think the main thing is the music, and that is possibly timeless. People pick on it and think, oh yeah, that's quite nice, and then they get into it and so on. But I'm quite fortunate and lucky to have been sort of spoon fed little by little, and it was always exciting when there's a new Beatles record coming out and so on. So that's why I think they're still so popular.
That's a terrific answer. There's a thing to be said for that relationship with the Beatles and Liverpool, particularly post-breakup. There was a period there, particularly when I was a young guy in the early 80s going to school, second generation fan. It wasn't cool to be a Beatles fan
No.
at all,
Mm.
and that was a bit tough as a younger guy to kind of find your people. But it seemed like there was a bit of a rebirth, and it became hip to kind of embrace them again, particularly out of Liverpool. I remember Beatles City opening up as a museum in the city in the 80s, and it seemed like Liverpool was beginning to reach back to this idea of the four lads who shook the world. But that wasn't always the case for a period there. What's your recollection of that and that relationship that Liverpool had?
Because, once they split up, there was a sort of more new music coming through. It was quite exciting. There's the likes of Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Pink Floyd, Black Sabbath, all coming through late 60s, early 70s, and a whole host of more groups. And, I was lucky to my first proper gig was 1973 in Liverpool at a venue called the Liverpool Stadium, which is where Ringo played, but the others didn't. But it was like a boxing ring. It was founded by Pete Best's family, and it was 4,000 capacity, but for the boxing and wrestling, but for the gigs they cut it in half and used the boxing ring as the stage. And I saw Deep Purple there in 1973, and people then were into all these groups that they came to Liverpool, and the Liverpool Empire as well. I saw Pink Floyd, Genesis, Yes, and so on. So many bands. There was a lot of interest when Paul came with Wings, both in 1973 and 1975, and that was impossible to get a ticket. But people still like the Beatles. But as I say, there was more other music around, and people were into that. And I think it takes a certain amount of time to pass before people start getting nostalgic about the past and remembering, oh yeah, that was good, and then going back. And as I said earlier, the death of John Lennon was the big spur to changing all this, because people realized there's never going to be the Beatles again. They could never reform, because there's always these rumors they're going to reform, or they will, and will they or won't they? And of course it never happened. So in that sense it was unique as well, because so many big groups do break up and then they do reform and so on, but it never happened with the Beatles. So it and again the actual city of Liverpool was pretty run down in the 70s. There were still bomb sites from the war 30 years previously that hadn't been filled in, and there was a lot of deprivation, unemployment, and it got worse throughout the 80s. And then they had this thing called the Liverpool Garden Festival, which took place in the early 80s, and it was part of a try and regenerating the town and bringing in tourism, because the most sort of famous aspect of Liverpool in the 70s and 80s was the football teams, Liverpool and Everton, and people around the world knew them, and that sort of brought tourists in. But people didn't really recognize their legacy of the Beatles until after John Lennon's death, and then things started taking off, and now there's like the Hard Day's Night Hotel, two Beatles museums. There's the Beatles experience in the Albert Docks, and then there's the Liverpool Beatles Museum up in by the Cavern in Matthew Street. So there's so many things, and all these tours. People want to go and see where Strawberry Fields is, and Penny Lane, and so on. So, and now the fact that you can actually visit both John Lennon's and Paul McCartney's childhood home is a big draw for a lot of people. So there's so much now, but in the 70s, early 80s, there wasn't much at all, and people weren't bothered. And I think it's just over time people realise, oh, let's a bit of nostalgia, and then it takes off.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point too. I was only young when John died. I was deep into my fandom, and when he vanished, it was at the height of me really getting into them and discovering the music. So it kind of hit me really hard as well, despite the fact, I was 11 years of age. But I think perhaps to the point that you're making, it's almost like when you lose someone for which there's a great love and reverence, even if it's family, it does, I guess, unlock this idea of everything's temporary, and I'm going to maybe pay more attention to the moments and almost at a global level. I guess that's almost what happens with them after John's passing, perhaps, is that there's this collective realization that we'll never see their likes again. And we might be a bit more relaxed about the fact they existed because there's a sense it might just happen that they pick the phone up, but there's no getting around. Once he's gone, there's never a chance. Maybe that's something that in the human psyche that unlocks this reverence for the past. Yeah. I was talking to Oliver Murray, who was the director of Beatles Anthology Episode 9, and he was telling me that part of his challenge was walking the tightrope creatively of this is not only for the hardcore fans, but it's also got to be about introducing new fans and talk to the current generation. You were mentioning before with the book that similarly you've had to do a bit of a tightrope walk there, I imagine also, right? So that there's enough appeal there for new fans that might be interested in unearthing the story and enough there for a diehard group of people that have fun with it as well. Was that a conscious thing for you, or did you kind of intuit that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I was aware that, this book's got to be quite appealing to a wide range of fans. So, the fact that there's the multiple choice answers. So, obviously a hardcore fan might know it, and that's it. But if you're a sort of young fan and don't know these things, at least you might be able to guess the answer. But it's just a bit of fun, and if you don't know the answer, fine, but you'll learn something from it and so on. But as I say, it's sort of fairly historical. It's not just obviously about the music, but it's about things that have happened and the people they've worked with and so on, and the influence they've left. So there's a mixture of everything, I think, for fans.
It's almost feels to me like a book that you might almost walk into a Beatles festival in a Beatles bar where there's perhaps in between tribute acts. The book is a living way to bring people together and interact in almost like a celebratory sort of mode, coming together for a fest of some kind. Do you imagine that perhaps also?
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice to, sort of do more of these, because obviously the book's only just sort of recently come out. So, it's great that you're doing the interview, because it all helps with the publicity and getting the book there. But it would be nice to, to reach a sort of Beatles audience more and more, really. Yeah.
We've got a Beatles festival that happens, if I have it right, it's August this year in a town called Bathurst, which is a few hundred kilometres out of Sydney. And this feels like it might be the perfect inclusion in that scene for those few days. I can just imagine it's going to have a lot of resonance with people in those communities coming together. So wish you all the best with it. Can you tell us where people might find the Magical Mystery Beatles quiz book? 1,000 questions with multiple choice answers. Where best to go?
It's on Amazon, basically, is the first port of call. That's what it looks like, just so you can see. Obviously, it'll be back to front if you're looking at it, but that's what the cover looks like. But just put Mark Chatterton Beatles book on Amazon, and you'll get taken to it, certainly. Yeah. And I've had a few nice 5-star reviews already from people, which is really encouraging. So I must be doing something right. So hopefully it will take off. Yeah,
good on you. Now it seems like, as we mentioned at the start, that from an author's perspective, you don't sit still. What might be the next project for you, or are you going to take a bit of a break?
Well, I've always wanted to write a Beatles book, and I'd like to do another one. But obviously, a quiz book is okay, because that's quite wide ranging. But there's been so many books on the Beatles over the years that there's not many subjects you could write about. But what I think I'd like to try and do, because I don't think anyone's really done this, in detail at least, is all the different people who played on Beatles records with them, like the classical musicians, the Indian musicians with George Harrison, and occasionally some session musicians, or Eric Clapton. Keith Moon did on All You Need Is Love. That's one of the questions, by the way. So there's a wide range of things, and then there's also Beatles, the various members of the Beatles played on other people's records that that I don't know if that's all really been covered, but there was a group who did the Beatles song "Gotta Hide Your Love Away," called the Silky, who were a folk group, and they had a top 20 hit with it. But actually, John, George, and Paul were all involved in the recording and production of the single.
Wow.
And it's probably quite a rare record nowadays, and not many people know about that. So there's all these little hidden songs that the Beatles were involved in, or the musicians that played with the Beatles. So I just wonder if there's a book there that is worth writing. But obviously, it's going to take a lot of research, and it probably won't be for a few years before it happens.
Yeah. It's endlessly fascinating, endlessly fascinating terrain, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mark, it's been a pleasure to speak with you from across the seas. Congratulations on the book, and best wishes for the next project ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mike, for putting me on the programme, and it's been fascinating and enjoyable time speaking to you. And thanks for the questions.